The Pacific skies in 1943 were vast, empty stretches broken only by clouds, sunlight, and the occasional flash of wings. 4 Japanese fighter pilots on patrol, those skies once seemed theirs to command. But on certain mornings, the horizon betrayed them. A low rumble began, faint at first, then swelling into a roar that rolled like thunder across the ocean. Eyes scanned the heavens, and then they saw them. Formations of B-24 Liberators, dozens, sometimes hundreds, emerged from the haze, sunlight glinting off wings that stretched longer than any Zero's fuselage. They were giants of the sky, 4-engine bombers moving with slow, relentless confidence. Japanese pilots, trained to pounce on nimble targets, now faced an entirely different foe. "We were stunned by their numbers," one aviator later recalled. The bombers stretched from horizon to horizon, and still more came. Known as the Flying Boxcar, the consolidated B-24 was a new breed of heavy bomber. Its broad Davis wing, designed for lift and fuel efficiency, gave it longer range than the famous B-17 Flying Fortress. Powered by 4 Pratt & Whitney R-1830 twin Wasp engines, the Liberator could carry over 8,000 pounds of bombs and reach targets nearly 2,000 miles away. In the Pacific, where distance defined the battlefield, that range was a weapon as deadly as any bomb. 4 Japanese pilots. The first encounter was not merely with machines, but with a revelation of industrial scale. In earlier battles, they had fought squadrons of American fighters and occasional bombers. But the Liberator arrived not in handfuls, but in waves. The tactic was deliberate. Massed formations flying in box patterns, overlapping fields of defensive fire from multiple machine guns. Attacking one meant braving the crossfire of many. Descriptions from American crews conveyed the same spectacle from the other side. A navigator aboard the 7th Air Force remembered peering from his window and seeing line after line of bombers above and below. "It felt as if we were an airborne city," he said. To the men inside, the formations gave reassurance. To the Japanese who watched them appear, they were a sign that the war was shifting. In 1943, the Allies had seized momentum in the Pacific. Guadalcanal had been secured, and operations expanded into the Solomon Islands and New Guinea. The B-24 became central to this new phase. Where B-17s had been too limited in range, the Liberator could leap across the ocean to strike Rabaul, Truk Lagoon, and oil refineries in the Dutch East Indies. Its presence meant no Japanese stronghold was safe from bombardment. The visual impact was profound. Fighter pilots accustomed to single-plane dogfights suddenly faced an armada. Ground troops stationed on islands reported looking up at the steady drone of engines that filled the sky for minutes at a time. The sound was unlike anything they had heard before, a rolling thunder that seemed endless. In Tokyo, commanders were alarmed. Japan's aircraft industry, strained by shortages of aluminum, fuel, and trained labor, could not match this pace. In 1943, Japan built fewer than 2,000 combat aircraft. That same year, Ford's Willow Run plant in Michigan was producing B-24s at a rate of 1 per hour. By war's end, over 18,000 Liberators would be built, the most of any heavy bomber in history. For the men in the cockpits of the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service, the difference was felt in combat. They dove their nimble Mitsubishi A6M0s into formations, only to be met by walls of .50 caliber gunfire. Some succeeded in downing Liberators, but for every bomber that fell, dozens more pressed forward, dropping bombs on supply depots, ships, and airfields. The first sight of those giants filling the sky was more than shock. It was a glimpse of inevitability. Japan's pilots realized they were not merely fighting planes. They were fighting an industrial power that could flood the skies without pause. The Liberator was not elegant, but it was unstoppable. And as those shadows passed overhead, stretching from horizon to horizon, they carried with them a message. The balance of the Pacific War was shifting, and the skies would soon belong to America. The origins of the B-24 Liberator traced back to the anxious summer of 1939, when war clouds gathered over Europe. The U.S. Army Air Corps issued a challenge. It needed a new bomber, one faster, longer-ranged, and more capable than the B-17 then entering service. The specification called for an aircraft able to carry 5,000 pounds of bombs over 3,000 miles at speeds exceeding 300 miles per hour. For most aircraft companies, such a demand seemed impossible. But at Consolidated Aircraft in San Diego, engineers accepted the task. Within months, they produced the first blueprints of what would become the B-24. Its most distinctive feature was the Davis wing, a high aspect ratio airfoil that provided exceptional lift and fuel efficiency. This design allowed the Liberator to fly farther and carry heavier loads than its predecessor, albeit at the cost of handling finesse. For Pratt & Whitney, our 1830 twin Wasp radial engines gave the bomber its power, while a tricycle landing gear, unusual for heavy bombers of the time, provided stability during takeoff and landing. The prototype, designated XB-24, first flew on December 29, 1939, a symbol of how quickly America's industry could respond to looming war. As the conflict spread across Europe and Asia, demand for heavy bombers skyrocketed. Britain, already under siege from the Luftwaffe, placed orders for hundreds of Liberators before the United States even entered the war. Production ramped up at Consolidated San Diego and Fort Worth plants, but soon the scale of the task outgrew any single company. The U.S. turned to its industrial titan, Ford Motor Company. At Willow Run, Michigan, Ford built what was then the largest factory in the world. Designed to mass-produce aircraft the way Detroit had built automobiles, the facility stretched nearly a mile long. Here, America's industrial genius came into focus. Specialized machine tools, conveyor belts, and precision jigs transformed aircraft construction from artisanal craft into true mass production. By 1944, Willow Run was rolling out one completed B-24 every hour, a feat unprecedented in aviation history. The numbers told the story. Between 1940 and 1945, more than 18,400 Liberators were built, making it the most produced heavy bomber of the Second World War. At its peak, over 100,000 workers labored at Willow Run, many of them women who joined the workforce in America's arsenal of democracy. The scale dwarfed anything Japan could achieve. In 1943 alone, American factories turned out 85,000 aircraft of all types, while Japan managed fewer than 17,000. For the Japanese war planners, this imbalance spelled eventual disaster. Aircraft production in the empire was constrained by shortages of raw materials, limited industrial capacity, and constant pressure from American submarine warfare and, later, strategic bombing. Where the U.S. could build thousands of long-range bombers, Japan often struggled to replace losses of fighters and training aircraft. Yet the story of the Liberator was not only one of numbers, but also of design philosophy. The aircraft was versatile, serving as a bomber, maritime patrol plane, cargo transport, and even as the famous C-87 Liberator Express. Its adaptability made it invaluable across multiple theaters. But nowhere would its presence be felt more profoundly than in the Pacific, where distances between islands demanded an aircraft with reach and endurance. Eyewitnesses who toured Willow Run during the war spoke of a staggering sight. Endless lines of fuselages sliding down the assembly line, wings craned into position, engines fitted in rapid succession. It was an industrial miracle, one observer recalled. For every Liberator that rolled off the line, Japanese commanders faced a problem with no solution. The birth of the B-24 was therefore more than the creation of a bomber. It was the embodiment of America's ability to mobilize its factories into weapons of war. The Japanese would encounter this machine in the skies over the Pacific not as an isolated threat, but as a flood. And with every hour that passed in Michigan, another giant of the sky was born, preparing to stretch its wings across oceans and bring the war closer to Japan's doorstep. The Liberator's first real test came not in the skies of Europe, but across the wide expanse of the Pacific. In the final days of 1941 and the early months of 1942, America reeled from Japan's rapid advance. Pearl Harbor lay in ruins, the Philippines were under siege, and the Dutch East Indies were falling. The United States needed a weapon with reach, something that could strike far-flung Japanese bases, disrupt supply lines, and prove that America could still contest the Pacific skies. The B-24 Liberator stepped into that role. Early deployments revealed both promise and peril. Mechanical teething problems plagued the bomber, as did the inexperience of new crews thrust into combat with only limited training. Engines overheated in tropical climates, navigation was treacherous across endless seas, and anti-aircraft fire was merciless. Yet the Liberator's unique advantage, its long range, quickly became apparent. Where the B-17 struggled to reach distant targets, the B-24 could leap across thousands of miles of ocean and return. The first B-24s in the Pacific belonged to the 7th Air Force and later the 13th. By early 1942, they were flying from bases in Australia and New Guinea, conducting reconnaissance and strike missions deep into enemy territory. Japanese-held oil refineries at Balikpapan in Borneo and shipping convoys supplying their armies became prime targets. These raids, though small at first, carried symbolic weight. America was hitting back. For crews, the experience was harrowing. Long missions lasted 12 to 14 hours, with little margin for error. Tropical storms battered formations, forcing them to navigate through sheets of rain and lightning. You could feel the plane shake and groan, one pilot recalled. But somehow the Liberator kept pushing forward. Below them, Japanese gunners tracked the formations with searchlights and flak bursts. Explosions tore the sky, and yet many B-24s managed to limp home on 2 or even 1 functioning engine, something crews remembered with awe. On the receiving end, Japanese defenders expressed equal astonishment. Bases thought to be safely out of range were suddenly under attack. Pilots reported their surprise at the sight of the 4-engine bombers appearing over oil installations and harbors. One Japanese officer later admitted that the raids forced a reassessment of Allied capabilities. If these aircraft could strike so far, no position in the Pacific was truly safe. Despite losses, the raids demonstrated the Liberator's potential. At Port Moresby in New Guinea, the B-24 became a workhorse in the campaign to blunt Japanese advances along the Kokoda Track and the approaches to Australia. Its ability to haul heavy bomb loads against shipping convoys disrupted the Japanese effort to reinforce frontline troops. Though not invulnerable, many were lost to Zero fighters and flak. The aircraft's presence became a constant pressure on Japan's overstretched supply system. By late 1942, the Liberator was firmly established as an indispensable part of America's Pacific arsenal. Its missions extended to the Solomon Islands, supporting the grinding campaign for Guadalcanal, and to the Dutch East Indies, where it struck refineries that fueled Japan's war machine. Slowly, the legend of the B-24 began to take shape, not as a flawless aircraft, but as a reliable giant with unmatched reach. Every flight carried risk, and every loss was felt. Yet the bombers kept returning, filling the skies with the steady thrum of 4 radial engines. For American airmen, these early missions were proof of resilience. For Japanese commanders, they were warnings of what was to come. The Pacific skies, once thought secure, were no longer theirs to command. The baptism of fire had begun, and the Liberator had proven it was here to stay. By 1943, the B-24 Liberator had moved beyond its baptism of fire. No longer an experimental newcomer, it had become the backbone of the U.S. Army Air Force's reach across the Pacific. From sprawling bases in Hawaii and northern Australia, and later from airfields carved into the jungles of New Guinea and the coral of the Marianas, the Liberator brought a new scale of war to Japan's empire. Every mission began the same way. The thunder of engines rising into the tropical air, the steady drone of 4 propellers multiplying until the sky vibrated like a giant drum. Crews described the deafening roar as waves of bombers lifted off in tight succession, climbing until their formations filled the heavens. On the ground, Japanese troops and island civilians alike looked up at the sight of wings blotting out the sun. It was as if the sky had turned into steel, one Japanese officer later admitted. The targets were chosen carefully. Japanese oil refineries in the Dutch East Indies, shipping convoys supplying garrisons from Rabaul to Saipan, and fortress islands guarding sea lanes, all came under attack. At Balikpapan, B-24s dropped tons of explosives on oil facilities vital to fueling Japan's fleet. Fires raged for days, sending black plumes of smoke into the sky. In February 1944, during Operation Hailstone, More than 70 B-24s joined carrier aircraft in striking Truk Lagoon, the so-called Gibraltar of the Pacific. Once a formidable naval base, it was left crippled, dozens of ships sunk, airfields shattered, and warehouses engulfed in flames. Japanese pilots scrambled to intercept, but the sheer number of bombers overwhelmed them. The Liberators' long range made these operations possible. From Darwin in northern Australia, B-24s could reach deep into the Dutch East Indies, hitting targets over 1,000 miles away. From the Central Pacific, they flew missions lasting up to 15 hours, carrying bomb loads that devastated Japan's fragile supply network. Japanese fighters, particularly the Mitsubishi A6M0, tried to stem the tide, but they faced withering defensive fire. Each Liberator bristled with up to 10.50 caliber Browning machine guns, covering all angles of approach. Crews remembered the tension of these encounters. A waist gunner recalled watching tracer fire streak through the sky as Zeros dived into the formations. "They came at us like arrows," he said, but the Liberators never broke formation. "We stayed in line, kept firing, and the sky lit up with fire." Many bombers returned scarred, engines burning or riddled with holes, yet the formations pressed on, dropping their loads before turning for home. For Japanese defenders, the strain was unbearable. Airfields once thought untouchable were bombed relentlessly. Supply convoys were shredded before reaching their destinations. Survivors spoke of the hopelessness of watching endless bomber streams glide overhead, immune to the limitations that plagued Japan's own air arm. By late 1943, shortages of fuel and spare parts crippled Japan's fighter squadrons. Pilots who once boasted of aerial supremacy found themselves outnumbered and outgunned. The devastation extended beyond the battlefield. Japanese civilians in occupied territories witnessed the destruction firsthand. Oil facilities, shipyards, and warehouses, pillars of the empire's war economy, were reduced to rubble. Each raid drained Japan's resources and morale. American crews, too, felt the toll. Missions were long, exhausting, and often deadly. Tropical storms tore at wings, flak shredded fuselages, and rescue at sea was far from guaranteed. Yet despite losses, the bombing campaigns grew in scale. By 1944, the Liberator had become the symbol of Allied air dominance in the Pacific. With the capture of the Marianas, new bases at Saipan and Tinian allowed B-24s, and soon their successors, the B-29 superfortresses, to reach Japan itself. The skies that once belonged to the rising sun were now ruled by American steel and firepower. The tide had turned. Where once Japanese pilots had ruled the air with nimble Zeros, they now faced the grim reality of overwhelming American numbers. The roar of Liberators above was more than sound. It was a signal that Japan's empire was shrinking, its defenses crumbling, and its skies no longer safe. For all its strengths, the B-24 Liberator was no invincible fortress. Its long wings and boxy fuselage made it instantly recognizable, but also vulnerable. Japanese pilots quickly learned to exploit its weaknesses, diving at angles where its defensive machine guns could not reach. And on the ground, Japanese anti-aircraft batteries, flak guns positioned around key strongholds like Rabaul and Balikpapan, filled the skies with black bursts of steel, cutting down bombers before they could release their loads. In late 1943, as Allied commanders intensified their strikes on Rabaul, crews of the 5th Air Force knew the risks. Missions often lasted over 12 hours, with Liberators forced to fly through layers of enemy defenses. In some raids, a dozen or more aircraft never returned. You could see them vanish in fireballs, one American gunner later remembered. One moment they were in formation with us, the next they were gone. The sight of a Liberator breaking apart in midair haunted survivors long after the war. Inside the aircraft, the conditions were brutal. At low altitudes, tropical heat turned the bomber's interior into an oven. At higher altitudes, the cold cut through even the thickest flight jackets, and frost formed on oxygen masks. Crews endured hours of deafening engine noise, cramped positions, and constant vigilance at their guns. Sleep deprivation and exhaustion were constant companions. Yet the missions continued, day after day. For the Japanese, engaging the Liberator came at equally high cost. Zero fighters, once unmatched in aerial combat, now faced bomber formations bristling with .50 caliber Browning machine guns. Diving through interlocking fields of fire, Japanese pilots risked everything to score hits. Many were shot down before they could close in, while others rammed their targets in desperate attempts to bring down the giants. Attacking them felt like flying into a storm of bullets, one pilot later recalled. At Balikpapan, where oil refineries fueled Japan's navy, the Liberators faced some of the heaviest flak of the war. In raids during 1944, dozens of aircraft went down in flames, torn apart by shells that burst at precise altitudes. Survivors spoke of flying through walls of fire, navigating black smoke that blotted out the sun. Those who made it back often did so with engines crippled, wings shredded, or fuselages riddled with holes. Some aircraft landed with landing gear locked. Others skidded on bellies across coral runways, anything to bring crews home alive. Despite the losses, the bombers kept coming. The B-24's endurance meant that even crippled planes could sometimes limp back on two engines, staggering across hundreds of miles of open ocean before finding refuge on a Pacific airstrip. Rescue units, from Catalina flying boats to submarines stationed along bomber routes, worked tirelessly to save downed crews. Yet thousands never returned, their names etched into casualty rolls, their sacrifice woven into the fabric of America's Pacific War. The cost of air supremacy was measured not only in machines, but in lives. By war's end, more than 10,000 B-24s had been lost in combat across all theaters, and tens of thousands of airmen had paid the ultimate price. Each mission underscored the grim arithmetic of strategic bombing. Overwhelming force could break an enemy, but only through relentless sacrifice. The Liberator was a machine of steel and rivets, but its story was written in human endurance. Crews strapped into its narrow fuselage knew that survival was never guaranteed. Yet they flew anyway, their determination forging the air supremacy that turned the tide of war. And for the Japanese defenders, every desperate sortie against the bomber formations highlighted the futility of their struggle. The skies were no longer theirs. By mid-1944, the balance of the Pacific War had tilted decisively. The fall of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, the Marianas Islands, gave the United States the airfields it needed to bring Japan's inner defenses within reach. It was a watershed moment. From these coral runways, fleets of B-24 Liberators, soon joined by the newer B-29 superfortresses, launched missions that would strangle Japan's war machine at its very core. The B-24, with its long range and heavy payload, remained the workhorse of the campaign. From the Marianas, Liberators targeted shipping lanes that tied Japan to its scattered empire. Tankers and transports laden with oil, rice, and munitions were hunted relentlessly. Convoys attempting to slip supplies to garrisons in the Philippines or Formosa often found themselves caught in the crosshairs of Liberator formations. Within months, Japan's maritime arteries were severed. A Japanese officer later admitted, "We could not move without being destroyed. The skies belonged to them." Nowhere was this clearer than in the Philippines campaign. As General Douglas MacArthur prepared his long-promised return in late 1944, B-24 groups pounded Japanese defenses ahead of the landings. Airfields at Clark, Nichols, and Tacloban were cratered beyond recognition. Liberators swept low to strafe runways and obliterate hangars, ensuring that Japanese aircraft never had the chance to contest the invasion. Shipping in Manila Bay and across the archipelago suffered merciless attacks, with vessels left burning or sunk before they could reinforce garrisons. For the crews, these missions were exhausting but decisive. Long flights over open ocean demanded precision navigation, often through storms or under threat of sudden interception. Yet with every raid, the Japanese position weakened. Air cover that had once been fierce now dwindled to sporadic resistance. When Zeros or newer Japanese fighters did rise to meet the bombers, they found themselves outnumbered and outgunned. The vast formations of B-24s seemed endless, a mechanical tide that could not be turned back. The psychological effect was profound. Japanese commanders watched helplessly as their ability to project force crumbled. Fuel shortages left aircraft grounded. Reinforcements bound for Leyte and Luzon were sunk before ever reaching the islands. Supply lines, once tenuous, now collapsed entirely. Soldiers on the ground faced not only Allied infantry but hunger, disease, and isolation, all brought on by the relentless disruption from the skies. For American airmen, the devastation was tangible. They saw the flames of oil refineries in Formosa lighting the night sky, the wreckage of convoys drifting across the sea, and the silent airfields that once launched waves of Japanese planes now reduced to smoking ruins. It was like watching an empire disintegrate in real time, one pilot later reflected. The strategic consequences were enormous. With the Marianas secured and the Philippines falling, Japan's outer defensive perimeter was shattered. The Liberator had been central to this collapse. It bridged the gap between the medium-range aircraft of the early war and the B-29s that would soon deliver the final blows. Where Japanese soldiers once looked up expecting to see clear skies, they now saw formations of American bombers blotting out the horizon. By late 1944, the tipping point had been reached. Japan's fleets were in ruins, its garrisons cut off, and its skies dominated by American steel. The B-24 had helped pave the way for MacArthur's return and the eventual march toward Tokyo itself. For Japanese officers, the shock was not only in the losses suffered but in the realization that no countermeasure remained. Their carefully prepared defenses could not withstand the relentless storm unleashed from the Marianas and the Philippines. The war had entered its final, desperate phase, and towering above the Pacific skies, the B-24 Liberator stood as both weapon and symbol, a testament to industrial might and the relentless momentum of a conflict that Japan could no longer hope to win. In the closing months of the war, Japanese pilots who once roamed the Pacific with confidence now looked up to skies they scarcely recognized. Where once there had been scattered formations of American aircraft, there now stretched fleets of B-24 Liberators so vast that horizons seemed filled with wings. For many, the image remained etched into memory long after the guns fell silent, an overwhelming spectacle of industrial might that dwarfed anything Japan could muster. By the war's end in 1945, the B-24 had become more than just another bomber. It had flown in every major theater: the jungles of New Guinea, the sands of North Africa, the skies over Europe, and the wide expanses of the Pacific. More than 18,400 aircraft were built, making it the most produced heavy bomber in history. Its contribution was staggering. Millions of tons of bombs dropped, thousands of reconnaissance and transport missions flown, and a generation of aircrews carried to distant targets that once seemed unreachable. For American crews, the Liberator was both a blessing and a burden. Its long range and massive payload made it indispensable, but its cramped fuselage, awkward handling, and tendency to catch fire when hit earned it a reputation as an unforgiving machine. Yet for all its flaws, it got the job done. Veterans later recalled the constant drone of its Pratt & Whitney engines, the sweat and fear of missions flown through flak and zero attacks, and the grim pride of returning home in battered but unbroken aircraft. One gunner summarized it simply: "It was ugly, but it brought us back." On the other side of the war, Japanese accounts reveal awe and despair. Pilots who once fought with daring against B-17s or carrier aircraft admitted they could not comprehend the endless stream of Liberators pouring into the Pacific. Every loss Japan inflicted seemed meaningless, as replacements appeared faster than they could be destroyed. A Japanese officer later reflected that the Liberator was less a plane than a tide, an industrial wave against which we had no defense. Historians view the B-24 as a symbol of the war's deeper truth. Victory was decided not only by courage or tactics, but by industry. Japan, with its limited resources and fragmented production, could never rival the United States' capacity to churn out thousands of aircraft, ships, and tanks month after month. The B-24 epitomized that imbalance. At its peak, Ford's Willow Run plant in Michigan rolled a new Liberator off its assembly line every 63 minutes. In contrast, Japanese factories struggled to replace even a fraction of the fighters lost in combat. The irony of the Liberator's legacy is sharp. The war that began with Japan's audacious airstrike at Pearl Harbor ended with Japanese skies dominated by American bombers. The very pilots who once believed in the supremacy of the Zero were forced to confront the reality of mass-produced giants blotting out the sun. The B-24 did not possess the elegance of the Zero or the brute glamour of the Tiger tank, but its numbers, reach, and persistence told the story of modern war more honestly. Wars are won by those who can sustain them. When the dust of the Pacific settled, the Liberator's silhouette lingered as a symbol. To American veterans, it represented endurance, sacrifice, and eventual triumph. To their Japanese adversaries, it embodied futility. The moment they realized the rising sun could not withstand the storm of American steel. To historians, it remains a machine that helped rewrite the rules of air power. Range, numbers, and relentless pressure mattered more than perfection. The legacy of the Liberator, then, is not only in its production figures or in the missions it flew, but in the lasting impression it left on all who encountered it. It was ungainly, often unforgiving, yet utterly unstoppable. And in that unstoppable momentum lay the story of America's victory. As the war closed, Japanese soldiers, sailors, and pilots looked up at skies filled not with the promise of empire, but with the shadow of defeat, cast by thousands of B-24s. The bomber that had begun as a blueprint in 1939 ended the conflict as a symbol of industrial supremacy. It was the machine that outnumbered the rising sun, and in doing so, helped end the greatest war in history.